So it's pretty basic, but it's got all the stuff there that you need just at face value. And obviously we'll dive deeper into the settings and adjustments in just a moment, but we'll quickly run through this first and just show you how everything works. So you can see as we rotate the wheel, we see the wheel rotate on the screen as you would expect. We've got a button here for centering the wheel. So if we go like that and hit center, it's off center. And if we center the wheel correctly, hit center, it's correct. We can see the real-time data from the encoder there as well. And then we can set our rotation in degrees. So we can go all the way up. I actually don't know how high this will go. We'll try and type in some crazy high number and see what happens, see if it jumps back to something else. No, I'm not sure. We can test that out later on as well. But it is being a direct drive motor. Oh yeah, that's going a little bit crazy. Being a direct drive motor, we don't have any mechanical bump stops at the end. So when we do rotate it around, that bump stop that we're hitting is a software-based thing. So that's fine. We've got our maximum force adjustment here, which is defaulting to 50%, so 10 Newton meters. What they recommend in their documentation is somewhere between about 40 and 60%. That also falls in line with what I normally run my SimuCube to Ultimate at as well. So I'm actually going to set this at 60% before I even go for a drive, because that's going to give me about 12 Newton meters, which is what I run my SimuCube at normally. That's going to give us the best shot at a good first impression, direct sort of comparison to the experience that I'm used to with that wheel. We'll talk about how we're going to tackle that side of the review in just a moment too. So moving over here, we'll go up to the top first. We've got a little drop-down menu that allows us to select between various different devices that might be connected to the PC. And I do know that they're working on some pedals at the moment as well. They've had a few posts on their website about that. So I'm assuming that we would probably use the same tool once those are released, and we just select it from the drop-down menu, but don't quote me on that just yet. We've got a button for reloading settings, saving our settings, setting back to factory default, and enter bootloader, which is where we flash firmware. So to upgrade the firmware, we would just click on that and then select the firmware file that we want to load, and then click open, and that would flash the firmware for us, but we're not going to do that now. Again, very simple, and that's going to recalibrate itself now as if it's a clean boot, just because it's come out of bootloader mode. So this is just the normal sort of startup process. So that's all good. Then we have a little drop-down menu here for profiles that we can save for individual sims or individual cars if you want to go into that level of granular detail too. And we can add a profile, create a new one there. You can see we've got profile 1 now in the list as well. And you can click on those and rename them too. So we might make this iRacing. So there we go. Now we have an iRacing profile and our default profile. We'll leave it on iRacing for now. We also have a button to remove profiles here as well, should we wish to get rid of something that we've got on a list that we're not using anymore, just to get rid of clutter. So that's good. Now I don't see a import and export for profiles, but again, remembering just how simple this is, it's not really hard to just sort of dial in somebody else's settings. And I will mention VRS has a really excellent library of suggested settings for not only the VRS wheel tool, but also the individual sim titles as well. And again, with the library of expert drivers that VRS has within their system already, you can be pretty much guaranteed that those settings are going to be completely on point. So we're going to start off just with default settings when we do go for a drive in a moment. I'll do some dialing in, and then I'll also try out their suggested settings when we go in and try out some of the different sim titles as well. So moving down now to the nitty-gritty of the settings, we've got a tab here for FFB or force feedback. We've got a tab for encoder, and that allows us to select the type of encoder which the motor has on it. Obviously, in this case, as we saw earlier in the video, we're using a BIS-C, so we're going to leave it on that. This encoder resolution here, remember earlier in the video as well, we mentioned that it had 4.19 million points of resolution. So these settings aren't something that you should ever need to touch. It's actually a little bit interesting that those are accessible by default. I would have thought they would have been locked out, but anyway, doesn't matter. And then we've got a debug tab here as well, which we can use to see the raw data that's being used on the motor. Zeros and ones there. The binary data, that's actually pretty cool. And then we can also log information as well. So should we ever need to send a log back to VRS for troubleshooting purposes, we can do that here as well. But what we're really interested in is this FFB tab here. So Again, pretty basic in terms of the adjustments that we have here. Some people will like this level of simplicity, especially coming from some of the more old school direct drive bases where there was a million things that you could adjust and you'd spend more time trying to fine tune than actually driving. So I am a little bit surprised by just how basic this is, but I guess as long as the quality of the force feedback feels good, then it doesn't really matter too much. But again, we'll comment on that once we go for a drive. So let's go through these settings that we have here one by one. Now we do have another video where I went through the fundamentals of force feedback and how everything works. So I would recommend if you want to sort of understand these in a finer detail than what we're going through in this video, then definitely check that video out. I'll link it above my head for you now, as well as down in the description. But the first one here is a smoothing filter. It goes from 0 through to 4. Now it's kind of like the interpolation filter or recreation filter that we see in True Drive from Simucube as well as Fanatics drivers. But a little bit different in that it's not sort of generating its own effects based off telemetry data or anything like that. It's using the raw direct input effects that we get out of the sim titles, either physics or canned effects, and then adding a smoothing effect on top of that. So this is going to be particularly noticeable in sims like iRacing, for example, where we are running at 60 Hertz refresh rate or sample rate for our force feedback. So what that should do, and obviously we'll comment on this when we go for a drive, is just smooth out those effects a little bit more, make them a little bit less robotic feeling and a little bit smoother in general. So it's not creating new effects based off telemetry data or anything like that. I just wanted to make sure that was really clear for you guys. It's just smoothing out the effects that are already present. So that's what the smoothing filter does. By default, that is set to 1. Then we have our damper, obviously goes from 0 to 100% with a default setting of 10. And this is sort of like a dynamic friction kind of setting. It slows down the rotation of the wheel and just dampens the overall effects that, that can be used to reduce a robotic feeling if there is any, but generally it just makes it feel a little bit more like what you would experience in a real car. Obviously in a real car, you've got the friction of the tires against the road surface. You've got a bit of flex in the shafts and the linkages and all those sort of bits and pieces throughout the mechanism inside the car. So that all adds a bit of a dampening effect and slightly disconnects the feeling between the wheel and the actual contact patch of the tires against the road. So obviously we'll need to be able to adjust this so that we can dial it in for different types of cars that we're driving, how this effect is actually implemented in different types of sims as well. So that's what the dampening effect does. And then we have an adjustment for friction. Again, all of these go from 0 to 100%. So friction is the amount of resistance that you feel against you as you turn the wheel. Inertia is almost like an acceleration effect. So as we turn the wheel, it will kind of continue to accelerate. Whereas if you have that set completely to 0, then as the wheel stops, it kind of just stops in place other than the natural immersion of the motor. Now, if we wind that up here, I'm not sure if it's actually going to have an effect on the wheel. No, so it must only do it inside the game once we're running. So yeah, when we make those adjustments here, I don't feel any difference, which is a little bit different from Simucube. In Simucube, you can actually feel those effects, even just sort of sitting static in the car, but we'll test all this out later on anyway. Then we've got our spring effect, which is just the strength of the wheel trying to fight against you and return back to center. So pretty self-explanatory stuff there, very simple and, not intimidating either. I think that's one of the really important things and one of the things I think that they've nailed here. And obviously, again, we'll talk about this once we go for a drive, but a lot of direct drive wheels, particularly Simucube and even Fanatic these days as well, with the number of adjustments that they have in the system. For a new person coming in that doesn't understand what all those things do, it can actually be quite intimidating. They get overwhelmed and they never actually put the time into, really fine tuning and adjusting and really getting it dialed into their personal preference. Whereas when you've only got a limited number of things that you can adjust, it kind of feels a little bit more enticing. I look at it and I kind of go, yeah, this is something that I can play with. This is something that I can spend a bit of time and dial in. So as long as the quality of force feedback feels good and we don't find that we actually need those additional settings, then I think that this is a good implementation. So yeah, excited to see how this feels when we drive. Now we do have these additional little drop down menus here as well, which we'll talk about just quickly for you as well. So we've got device effect only, game effect only, and device and game effects. So we talked about this extensively in our force feedback explain video that I mentioned earlier. So definitely check that out if you want to understand more here. But essentially what this is doing is this is applying these effects to either just the force feedback effects that are being generated in the driver and the firmware side of things. So outside of canned effects that are coming out of the sim titles themselves. So it's important to understand there is a difference between effects that are generated essentially by the physics of the game, as opposed to what we refer to as canned effects, which are essentially just like almost like a sound file that's being played back through the bass. So when you run over a ripple strip, it's always kind of the same effect rather than actually being generated by the physics of the game engine. So if we set these to device effect only, it means that the filter is only operating on those physics generated effects. If we set it to game effect only, obviously only on the canned effects. And if we set it to both, then it is taking effect on both, obviously. So what VRS are recommending in their literature is device effect only. I think the wording they use is that there wouldn't be many scenarios where you wouldn't want to have this set to device effect only. So that's what we're going to do as a starting point. And yeah, I think that we're now ready to go for a first drive.